Hi, this is Don and I am back with another tutorial for VideoFort. Today we are back in Cinema 4D and we are going to be building a DNA strand animation, starting with some stuff in Cinema 4D, and at the end we will do some basic compositing and finishing touches in After Effects. So there are a few things to go over in this one, so we're just going to jump in and see what we can come up with. Okay, so let me show you where we're going to end up after we have done everything. This is the render in After Effects, where I've just done a few things to make it look better. Just some basic color correction, some depth of field effects, and that's about it actually. But this of course is made mostly in Cinema 4D. Let me show you the render in Cinema 4D, and this is what it looks like. So let's go ahead and build this in Cinema. Right, so I'm gonna start with a cube, and let's go for 6x6 for the X and Z size, and for the Y I will set this to 500. I'm gonna also give this a lot of segments in the y-axis. Let's go for 200 for now. You can't see the segments here, so let me change this to grow shading with lines so we can see the edges. Okay, I will move this to 10 in the X position, actually 20 instead of 10, and I'm gonna make a copy, and this one will be -20. So this will be the two sides of the DNA strand. Okay, we need all the stuff in between. So this is going to be another cube. This time I'm gonna go for a size in the X of 20, 4 for Y, and 4 for Z. So it's just another bar going in the other direction like this. And let's give this 10 segments like this. I'm going to go to the coordinates, and this time it's going to be set to 10, so it's just on the right side. And we need more of these, so if I hold ALT and get the cloner as I do this with the cube selected, the cloner will inherit the position and the rotation values, so it's already in the right place, as you can see here. Alright, and in the cloner I will set the mode to be grid array. We don't need any in X or Z, so I'll put those to 1, but we do need a whole bunch in the Y direction. Let's just make sure this is the right sort of start and end point, and then we just need to have a bunch of these. I think 35 will work in this case, so this here. So we have the right side now. We need to make a copy of this and throw this across to the other side, just like this. So let's separate these into two nulls. This is the clones on the right side and the cloner on the right side. So we have this. Let's take another null, and that's going to be on the other side. So we can label these L and R for left and right. And if we look back at the original animation, you will see that at the beginning, the two sides of the strand are separated. There's a gap. And then as you play to the end, they slowly come together basically and link up in the middle. So let me show you how I did this animation. There's two parts to this. One is we need to separate these to create that gap. And then of course the twisting effect you see here. So let me show you how this was done. If I go to the deformers menu, I can get a bend deformer. And let's start with the left side. Just put the bend deformer in the same null object as the other two things here. Let's change the size of this to just only encompass the part of the geometry we're trying to affect. So make the height just over 500. I will set the X size to 30, and then I'm going to move this to -10 in the X position, and that's going to house the left side of this. So let's make it smaller, something like this. And now if I go to the angle here, I can actually, no, the strength, you can see that I can bend this away from the other side, just like this. So I'm going to start this at -10 and set a keyframe there. I'm going to just extend my timeline to be 8 seconds. Go to the end and bring this back to 0, just like this, and control click to set the keyframe. So playing this back, this is what we have, just a slow return to the middle. So as you can imagine, we need to do this to the other side. So let's just copy this, and instead of -10, it's going to be 10. So going in the other direction, and let's keyframe this. And now it's going to come back to the middle as well, just like that. Let's just position this correctly though. So it's similarly positioned to its counterpart on the left side there. Okay, so that's the first step of this effect. Kind of looks like a zip animation of some sort. Okay, so to get the DNA effect, you know, the famous double helix structure, we have to use a twist deformer. Now, because this is being applied to the whole structure instead of the two individual sides, that means we need to put everything inside of another null. So take both of these and put them in here, and let's call this strand, just like that. So if we go back to the beginning, where the general shape of this is the largest, I'm gonna take a twist deformer. So let's bring that in. And again, this also just needs to be large enough to contain our geometry, and not any larger than it needs to be. So something like this here is going to work just fine. And again, put the deformer above the objects you want to affect. Anytime you have any objects inside of a null, if the deformer is in the same level but higher than them, it's going to have an effect. And I think even at any sort of order, it's going to work. So this could be between, it could be below. As long as it's inside of the null, it's going to work fine. Okay, now you can see that DNA effect happening. All right, I'm gonna start this at 1000, not 100, 1000. So something like this. And let's set a keyframe here. Go to the end of our timeline and maybe set this to 1100, and then set a keyframe there as well. So we have this slow animation of the DNA molecule being sort of wound tighter to meet in the middle like this. Okay, the keyframes have easy ease by default, so let's open this and just close that up. Linearize these keyframes. If I press Ctrl A to select everything, I can tick linear, and now we'll have some slow constant motion throughout our animation, just like this. Okay, so now we have the geometry set up and the animation. I think next we could do the actual look of the effect. So this organic looking kind of texture. Let me show you how this was done. First of all, our geometry is too blocky right now. Maybe I should have used like tubes or something instead of the cube. but it's not a problem. I can select both of these sets of cubes and just tick fillet. And in all the cases, just make sure that the maximum fillet radius is set. And it's always going to be half of what the width and height, or width and depth in this case. So 3 is going to give us a perfectly rounded shape as a result. Okay, or you could just use the tube or cylinder to begin with, with a bunch of height segments, and narrow it down like this. Same thing. Okay, let's now make a material for this. And in this material, we're not going to use the color channel in this case. We are interested in the luminance channel and the reflectance. So in luminance, let's get the Fresnel effect. And that's how we get the highlight around the edge, darker in the middle kind of look, which is what you see here. So let's set the colors. I was using a blue, and if you want to do the same thing as me, the hue was set to 200, so you can do the same as well if you want. And I will click OK, and you can see the the beginning of building this kind of look. All right, very basic so far. I'm gonna throw this into a layer, and let's open this, go to shader, just a simple color shader this time, and use the same tone of blue, just set to something like this. And I will add this color on top of the other one, but lower the opacity to maybe something like 10, just so the center isn't completely blacked out like before. Okay, next up in our reflectance, the default specular here, I'm gonna make it narrower. So let's go for 40, but I'm gonna make it really tall and bright like this, and then bring back the fall off to just sharpen that highlight. Maybe something like this over here. Okay, there's more to do. And if you look at this, we have this organic looking kind of shape to this. It rounds off the edges, and then some places are thicker, some places are narrower, and so on. And the way I did this was using displacement. So if we go in here, let's load up a basic noise texture. And actually, if I just apply this to my cubes, and I'm doing this individually like this, and I will show you why later, and render this, and now you can see we have the the bulging in some areas, and it just creates this really interesting kind of look. But this is just the general shape. There's a lot more texture we need to build into this, but I think maybe this is too extreme anyway. So let's go back in here, and let's set the height of the displacement to something like 2.5, and it just lessens the effect, but still looks pretty good. Okay, what I'm gonna do here is enable my interactive renderer so we can see what we are doing as we change the material. So if you press Alt and R, that brings up this interactive render region, and let's set the quality to be 100%, just like this. Okay, and the way we get the texture to make this look a bit more interesting is in the bump channel. So I'm gonna start with another noise map, and already you can start to see something a bit more interesting. And let's put this into a layer, and then in the first noise layer here, let's set the global scale to just 20 to make that noise smaller. Let's go back to this level. I'm gonna make a copy, shader, and paste. So exactly the same thing there, but this time we'll go with a scale of just 10. You can see this is overriding the one below, So let's set the blending mode to multiply so that we blend the two together like this. And then I'm going to make another copy of this, but this time let's return it to 100% and use a different noise type. Now I don't remember what it was called, so we can just scroll through these until I find the right one. And I believe it is this SEMA or SEMA. I don't know how you pronounce that exactly, but it gives you these lines and swells to overlay on top of the other noise. I'm gonna just switch things around here. Let's set the top color to be white and color number 2 to be black. And then at this level, let's set this to multiply as well, so that it just overlays on top of the original texture. So you can continue to build this up until you're happy with how that looks. You know, the more noise layers you put on top and blend them together, you can achieve a really interesting organic looking kind of texture, just like this. I think I'm gonna lower the original scale to 10, and the second one is going to be set to 5 instead, just to make that noise finer and smaller. Okay, and as far as the actual look of the material, that's it. Not really much else to this. The only other thing is in the displacement, we want to maybe put some motion and movement into this. So if you come in here, there is a control called animation speed, and if I turn this on at 1, we don't see anything change yet, but if I right click the preview section here and animate, you will see the noise moving around. Now for reference, I think the movement you see here, I think this was set to 1, so that might be too fast or too slow for your liking. You can just adjust the speed here and then just kind of go with what you think works best for you. I think I'm going to go for something a lot lower and you know, smoother motion, so maybe 0.25 instead. Okay, so that is it for the general look of this. Let's now construct this into an actual scene instead of just this single strand we currently have. So all I did here was take everything I've made up to this point and put this inside of a null. So not a null, rather a cloner. And I set the mode to radial, and the plane was set to XZ. So they're still facing upright like this. I set the radius of this to 200, and the count was left at 5. But perhaps, you know, we could put more or less, just depends on how busy you want your scene to look. Okay, these deformers can be a bit distracting if you can see them, so you can actually just select them and hide them using the traffic lights like this, and they will still, you know, they still work. You just can't see them, and it just cleans up our viewport a bit here. Okay, with the cloner selected, I'm gonna go to MoGraph Effector and Random, and let's play around with some of the options here. I will set the positioning to be 100 on all the different 3 axes, whatever you would call that. And rotation, I will do the same here. Let's go for 20 by 20 by 20, just to randomize the positioning of these a small amount. Okay, and then get a camera. Let's look through this. We want to go to the end and sort of pick where we want to be looking at as this animation finishes. And I think one of these sections is going to be place this in the center of the scene, kind of this way. But I am going to tilt my camera here, so that's a bit more sideways. And this would be my final sort of composition. So what I can do is set the keyframe here, and we are only animating the position. Maybe center this a bit more. So, control click the position coordinates here, go to the beginning of the animation, and maybe just zoom out slightly like this. Of course, you would take more care at this stage and create something a bit more elaborate than just a simple pan, zoom in animation. All right, and again, just make these keyframes all linear, so we have that constant motion. So in this case, we would have something like this. It's a bit slow, but you get the idea. Okay, by the way, if anyone was wondering how I tilted the camera, it's my keyboard shortcut, which is the number 3 on the keyboard. And let me jump out of this. And you just right click and then go left or right to tilt the camera however you want. Okay, let's undo that camera motion. Okay, so there is one more element, or elements rather. If we go back to this, you can see we have these floating particles. Let me show you how I did these. I took a sphere and made it large enough to contain the entire scene, so that includes the camera. And let's just switch this off so we don't actually see it, but don't disable it, with the tick. Leave that on, but just hide it. And I'm gonna take another sphere, this time set the size to just 1. And let's lower the segments to 10. It doesn't need to be any more than that. Of course, you can see it right now. It's very small in the center of the scene. But I will put this inside of another cloner and put this in here. The cloner is getting a lot of work today. And set the mode to object. And the object is going to be that large sphere. By default, this will clone onto the edges, or I think the point at which the edges meet. So let's change this distribution from vertex to surface. Not surface, actually, volume, which means it's going to clone within the volume of the sphere, which in this case is our entire scene. So let's put the count up to 1000, and if I look through my camera again, as the camera is slowly moving forward, you can see the particles floating around in the scene as well. So they're not really visible right now, or they are, but the default gray color. So I would take that material, make a copy of that, and just disable displacement in this case, and put this onto our cloner. And there we go. And let me isolate the camera and that setup for the particles, so our scene is a bit more responsive. By the way, I don't know how many times I've mentioned this, the plugin I use to isolate things is called Magic Solo. It's a free plugin. Just Google this, made by a guy called Nitroman, and it's one of the most useful plugins ever made for cinema. Cinema does now have a tool over here which you can do the same kind of thing, but I'm just so used to using this. It's kind of part of my layout, my user interface here. Very useful. Okay, moving on. Let's go to MoGraph and get a random effector with our cloner selected. I will set the position to be, again, 100 by 100 by 100. And I'm going to go to the Effector tab and change this random mode from the default random to noise. And this allows us to animate the randomness, so to speak. So if I play this, it looks crazy, right? So it's just too fast. Let's put the animation speed down to maybe 5%. And even that's probably still too fast. So maybe 1, just so our particles are not, motionless, but also not too crazy. Okay, so at this point you would output your animation, and let me show you my settings for this. So resolution, whatever you need it to be. I have a frame rate of 24, and frame range, we want the entire animation, so all frames. And by the way, I also like to set my actual project frame rate to be the same as what we see here. So if I press Ctrl D to bring up the project settings, in the FPS here, I will match that to my render output. So let's do 24 as well. And for the format, I used an RPF sequence, which is a series of images. The reason I chose the RPF format is because in After Effects, I extracted a depth pass, which I used to create the depth of field effect. I'm not going to go into that here because I have covered this in a separate tutorial to show you how to use a depth pass to create your depth of field. But you could also just bake this into your actual render. So if we go back to our camera, let's go to details and let's map the rear blur. And in the render settings, I would enable depth of field. And if we jump out of the camera, let's make sure that the focus distance goes up to the first piece of DNA here. So if I set the distance to about 200 or so, that's not close enough, but I can grab this and then point it just past where our DNA is there. And now if I go back into the camera and hit render, we can render the blur into the actual frames themselves, but this means that you won't be able to change this afterward. But if you don't have the plugin in After Effects or don't want to use that method, you can still achieve the look by just doing it this way. And at this point, it doesn't matter what format you output as, you just choose whichever you prefer to work with, which usually for me is PNG 16-bit. Okay, and just output this somewhere. There is one thing which I forgot to mention, but I said I would, and it's to do with how I placed the material individually onto each cube at this level, rather than what you might normally do is just place this onto the cloner itself, because visually it's going to look identical. But let me show you a problem you will run into if you place it onto the cloner. If I just start rendering this, if you pay close attention to the texture here, you will see that it does this weird sliding effect where the geometry is moving, but the texture doesn't seem to be sticking to the surface of the geometry. So you have this weird parallaxing kind of effect. If I zoom in here, you can see it's quite obvious in some areas there. So what you have to do is use what's called the stick texture tag, which does exactly what it's named. If you go to Cinema 4D tags, it's right here, stick texture. And this is going to force the texture to stay on the part of the geometry that it's supposed to be on. But it will not work at this level. But if you move the texture down to the individual geometry and then copy this tag onto each piece and then re-render, your texture will now behave as you would expect and stick to your geometry and work just fine. So that's just a weird thing you might run into, but now you know how to fix that as well. And then in After Effects, let me show you a few things I did just to make the scene a bit more interesting. So of course, this was rendered with an alpha channel, which again, just come here and enable alpha and straight alpha, which means we don't have pixels on our background. So this is what the render actually looked like. And then I put a gradient behind this, just a simple gradient ramp. And of course, we have our blur layer and a fast box blur layer set to 40 for the radius. But I set the blending mode to soft light to create just this kind of diffused, darker kind of look. So that is doing this in this case. Okay, and on top of this, just some basic color grading with the curves adjustment. So, you know, take out some of the red, put in a bit of green and blue to achieve the final look. And that's it. That is how I ended up with the final animation. So that would be it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something new, but that's it from me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.